These stories come from The Humanoid Encounters, The Others Amongst Us by Albert S. Rosales. I'd like to take a moment and read the types of close encounter classifications he has listed. Type A, when an entity or humanoid is seen inside or on top of an object or unidentified aircraft. Type B, when an entity or humanoid is seen entering or exiting a UFO. Type C, when an entity or humanoid is seen in the immediate vicinity of a UFO. Type D, when an entity or humanoid is seen in the same area where UFOs or unknown objects have been reported. Type E, when an entity or humanoid is seen alone without related UFO activity. Type F, when there is a psychic contact between entities or humanoids, but an entity or humanoid is not necessarily seen. Type G, when there is direct contact or interaction between a witness and a humanoid or entity, either involuntary as a result of a forced abduction or as a voluntary contact. Type H, when there is a report of an alleged crash or forced landing of a UFO with recovery of its occupants, or when an anomalous entity is captured or killed either by a witness or military personnel. Type X, when the situation is so uncanny that it doesn't fit any of the previous classifications, a new classification. There are several such cases in the files already. I would like to call these cases extremely high strangeness events. This story takes place October 19th, 1975, Llangollen, New South Wales, Australia, 6 p.m. Written by Brian Dixon and Moira McGee for Euphoria, New South Wales, Australia. On a Sunday evening, the witnesses going by Mr. and Mrs. M were driving home to Armidale after attending a one-day-long show in Inverell. It was dusk and it was cool outside. The 1974 Ford station wagon windows were closed. The car heater was running and the headlights were on high beam. Mrs. M was napping in the passenger seat and their dog, a 10 to 12-month-old Samoyed, was asleep in the back seat, which had been let down for it. They were traveling along the New England Highway in a southward direction at between 110 to 120 kilometers per hour. After passing Glen Innes, they drove downhill on a fast right turn 4 to 6 kilometers north of Llangollen. Mr. M suddenly noticed a bright light rising up over the hill directly to the left of their car. The light cleared the hill some 15 to 20 meters above the level of the road. It had began descending at a slight angle to a point level with the station wagon, between the road and the side of the hill. The creamy white light from the object was getting so bright that you could have read a newspaper inside the vehicle, said Mr. M. Mr. M was so startled that he said aloud, "What the bloody hell?" From his yelling and the bright light, his wife and dog woke up. The dog yelped and climbed over the front seat onto Mrs. M's knee and frantically tried to bury its muzzle in her lap. The dog was extremely distressed and was hard to calm down. Mrs. M said that at first she was a little disoriented and had thought that it was a large truck trying to pass them. Mr. M slowed the station wagon to about 40 kilometers per hour to have a good look at the light source. The object came into view, and it was a long cigar-shaped object with a bright silvery sheen, like the back of a new unpainted aluminum road sign. The object was 25 to 30 meters away and 50 to 50 meters long. It had short, thick, stubby wings and a large front cockpit window. There were 6 other large windows, in 2 parallel rows of 3, one row above the other, down the side of the object between the main cockpit window. 5 smaller windows were located above the 6 large windows. All of the windows were brightly lit. They could clearly see inside of the front cockpit area, which was where most of the light was coming from. 2 figures were sitting down towards the nose of the object, in white back chairs that looked a bit like lounge chairs. 3 more figures, visible from the waist up, stood close by, looking out of the large cockpit window directly towards Mr. and Mrs. M in their vehicle. The standing figures were clearly humanoid and seemed pretty normal. All wore silvery-colored overalls from the neck down. The cockpit cabin was full of instrument panels with dozens of green, blue, and red lights, some of them pulsating. There were no markings visible anywhere on the object, and no sort of landing gear was apparent. The two seated figures, who seemed to be the operators or pilots, kept turning their heads and glancing out the cockpit towards the station wagon. There were two large red pulsating lights or dials directly in front of these operators. The shortest standing figure was laughing and pointing at the station wagon, possibly at the antics of the dog. This figure appeared to be female, with shoulder-length brownish hair and bumpiness in the right places, said Mr. M. She seemed to be in charge, and there were 3 horizontal stripes on the left shoulder of her overalls. Red, blue, and red. The 3 standing figures seemed to be smiling, and the woman waved. The object seemed to be closely pacing the station wagon. When Mr. M slowed down from about 120 to 40 kilometers per hour, then a little later when he sped up to 70 and 80 kilometers per hour, and finally when he stopped the station wagon. The object moved alongside the station wagon for about 3 kilometers, over to the left of the road, and at about the same level. It floated some 18 to 30 meters above the ground, which sloped steeply away from the road, not unlike an ocean liner trying to overtake the car, said Mr. M. Occasionally a tree passed between them and the object. There was a faint bluish-reddish jet coming from the tail of the object at all times. Mr. M kept slowing the station wagon down until he stopped it altogether by the side of the road. The object, keeping pace, also stopped and hovered. A sharp-edged cone-shaped light, halfway along and below the main of the body of the craft, came on while the object was hovering. Mr. M then got out, but Mrs. M remained inside with the dog, which was still a little upset. He took out his movie camera and put first a yellow, then a green filter onto the lens and took some film shots of the hovering object. At this stage, Mr. M realized the object was making hardly any noise other than a faint hissing sound. Mr. M took several film sequences of the hovering object. According to subsequent investigation by Bill Chalker, Mr. M said that during the latter part of the hovering stage, he had the clear mental impression that they told him they were peaceful and would return sometime in the future. After hovering at this location for about 10 minutes, the object quietly moved off the left side of the road before turning right through about 30 degrees and crossing over it. The craft then headed off westward at a very steep angle until it was some 600 meters above a hill less than a kilometer to the right of the road. There it hovered for a few minutes, the bright cone of light from beneath it lighting up the trees on the hill below, clear as day. Mr. M got back into his vehicle and continued driving along at 40 to 45 kilometers per hour towards Llangollen, keeping an eye on the object. It seemed to keep 5 to 8 kilometers from the station wagon, moving parallel to the road for the next 5 to 12 kilometers for 20 to 30 minutes. At first it traveled very slowly, before moving off southwards again, with the station wagon following on behind along the road. When the station wagon was about 2 kilometers south of Gyra, the object gathered speed and disappeared westwards along a flat trajectory. There had been no other traffic on the road at all during this period. Some 3 to 4 days after the incident, Mr. M posted his film directly to Melbourne for developing. It was returned some 2 weeks later, but when viewed, showed none of the film sequences with the object. After carefully checking the film, Mr. M found that the film had been spliced and was 4 to 5 meters shorter than expected. Mr. M wrote a letter of complaint to the film processor, who replied with a form letter saying that it was their policy to not print anything obscene or detrimental. However, they included 2 rolls of unexposed film. The original form letter had since been thrown out. Several weeks later, Mr. M received a strange phone call. The male caller suggested that Mr. M had not seen anything. I found this story very interesting because for the most part, this is an extremely long time to be viewing a UFO. Usually a sighting seems to be at the most 5 minutes long, but a lot of the times even less than that. It was also interesting that Mr. M had such a clear view into this flying craft, as that's not very typical. especially with the apparent leader waving at him. What was weird is that he hardly mentions what their facial features look like, but had great recall of their clothing. It almost felt like these aliens were tourists just getting an up-close view of humans and their pets. It makes me wonder if aliens have pets at all too. With the film not being given back to him, it just seems really suspicious. I'm not sure how tight-lipped the Australian government is, but it seems from this story that they follow in the footsteps of the United States with wanting to keep sightings a secret and threatening witnesses into silence. What do you think of this case? This next story takes place in January 1977 during the night in Clearwater, Colorado. The source being Leo Sprinkle and John Durr from APRO. The main witness and his wife had bought a ranch in an isolated area in 1975, and for more than a year they had been experiencing strange sounds, UFO manifestations, and Bigfoot sightings on the property. There were some cattle mutilations as well. One night, the witness and his eldest son went up to the top of a hill to examine a burned spot from the previous year. As they sat in the car, a beam of yellow light shone on them from the nearby woods. Walking towards the trees, they discovered a buzzing black box, clearly seen in the light of the full moon. As they approached, it changed tone, now sounding like a swarm of angry bees. The two retreated to the safety of the car. The witness told the young man to stay by the car and went back to the spot where the black box had been. It was now gone. He saw a light in the trees and, walking towards the light, came upon two individuals standing near the light source. As he approached, they spoke to him, saying, "How nice of you to come." Some distance away, down a slope, was a disc, illuminated about 50 or 60 feet away. The two beings apologized for the trouble they had caused, promising a more equitable arrangement. They told him several things he was not to repeat, but which had no special meaning for him at the time. They regretted the damage done to several of the cars, but they did not acknowledge responsibility for any of the local cattle mutilations. They told him he was wise to have backed off from the black box, which was nearby. They pointed in a particular direction, and the tone of the box changed. As it did, a Bigfoot-type creature got up off the ground and walked toward the box. The tone changed and the creature dropped. The meeting lasted 5 minutes. In appearance, the beings were small, human-looking, about 5'6" in height, and wearing a tight-fitting outfit like a flight uniform. The suit changed colors from brown to silver. Their complexions were fair, and they had blonde hair, not long. The most notable features were the eyes, which were very large but otherwise normal-looking. They were different in subtle ways, but could pass as humans in ordinary situations. Before the witness walked away from the scene, he was told by the beings that he would see them again. This is such a bizarre story to me. I find this case to be special because not very often in these cases do people just walk up to what seems to be aliens, maybe even something close to Nordics, and get to have a conversation. I have no idea what this black box could have been, but to me it seems almost like it could make these Bigfoot creatures appear at their will and could control them as well. It also seemed to maybe have some sort of security system within it, and that sound of buzzing bees would deter a person from getting too close to the thing. This lends credibility to the theory that all these high strangeness beings, like cryptids and aliens, could all be connected. And it makes me wonder, if these aliens are not responsible for the cattle mutilations, then who is? Could it be a different race of beings, or something different altogether? Do you have any theories? The following story comes from UFO Sweden Reports, near Värnamo, Småland, Sweden, January 28, 1976, 6 p.m. The witness, going by Lars Eriksson, a repairman at the local Frishida rubber factory, was at work for the second shift like usual, when suddenly the boiler stopped working for no apparent reason. Erickson was very surprised. He checked all the valves, but could not find any fault in them. Then he walked over to the fuse box to check on the fuses. He then made several futile attempts to start the boiler, and in addition, he attempted via a valve to release steam from the boiler. But strangely enough, no steam seemed to emanate from the valve, and while working on the steam valve, he noticed that the control booth indicated that the ventilation fan on the third floor of the facility had also stopped working. Completely confused, Erickson realized that nothing seemed to work and that now both boilers were out of commission, which was technically impossible. It was now 8:15 in the evening. Moments later, the entire electrical power grid malfunctioned, not only in the factory, but apparently in the whole community of Rashida. Amazed and confused, Lars put on a jacket and walked to the nearby pump house, located about 700 meters away from the main building. He had decided to start the cooling water pump that serviced the machinery in the factory. When he was halfway there, he suddenly saw at a distance of about 25 to 30 meters away a short, dark figure, which at first he thought was a boy of about 7 or 8 years old. The figure was apparently on its way to the fuse box. His first thought was, "How did you get in here?" since the main gate and the gate to the pump house were locked. He must have crawled under the fence, Erickson thought. The strange figure stopped and looked in the direction of Erickson and raised its right hand, as if in a greeting gesture. This caused Erickson to stop in his tracks. As Erickson attempted to greet what he still thought was a boy and walked towards it, he realized that he was unable to move. His whole body was paralyzed, even though he did not experience any discomfort and never felt threatened by the figure. He finds it hard to describe his inability to move any part of his body. At this point, the short boy-like figure made a sudden remarkable turn or about face, which Erickson had never seen a human being do so before. It appeared to have been in a sort of floating motion, making a complete U-turn motion. At the same time the figure made this remarkable turn, it also made a giant leap or step, which later Erickson measures it to have been about 1.5 meters. Looking at the creature's back, which now Erickson was convinced that it was definitely not a human boy, Erickson could see that it wore a sort of large dark helmet that fell down to its shoulders. This presumed helmet seemed to be square in shape. The strange figure jumped like a beast as it departed, said Erickson, the whole time its body curiously leaning forward, as if squatting. It went very quickly, leaving a 1-meter-long track in the snow. Erickson could only describe the being as about 1 meter in height, black in color, and wearing a square helmet which reached down to its shoulders. His physique appeared normal, like that of a human being. After examining the creature's footprints, Erickson was able to conclude that the feet were wider in the front than in the rear, 16 inches long, and grooved at the bottom, leaving an imprint of about 7 to 8 millimeters in depth in the fresh snow. Erickson also recalled hearing a strange sizzling sound moments before he was unable to move. Now something even stranger occurred. According to Erickson, the creature seemed to bend at the waist and almost lie down. It then sat down on what now Erickson realized was some kind of invisible object or craft, straightened up slightly, and flew away, emanating a strange sizzling sound, like the one Erickson had heard before, which quickly rose into a sharp, intense whining. The humanoid lifted from the ground, sitting or reclining inside a vehicle that was either invisible or seemed to be there, and Lars for some reason could not see it. The figure rose in between a couple of trees located at the rear of the factory until it disappeared, becoming a small dot in the sky. Soon after, the 56-year-old Erickson was able to move again. Even though footprints of the strange creature were found, no trace or imprints of the apparent invisible craft were located. This story is quite interesting to me. I'm fascinated by stories where machines and electronics stop working. What kind of technology do these beings appear to have that could do this? I also find it interesting that we have a common theme of hearing some strange noise accompanied by seeing these beings, which seems to happen often when people have encounters. I also wonder how often people are suddenly unable to move. Could it be from some technology of these beings? Or is it our primal instincts taking over and making us freeze? What was the most interesting about this case was how this humanoid got into a seemingly invisible craft. I feel like I have never read about something like this. Was this craft actually invisible, maybe with some sort of cloaking system? Or was Erickson simply not able to see whatever the craft was for whatever reason? And it seems even more strange that he could still see the being. What are your thoughts on this? Thank you for watching this video. I hope you liked it. If you want more videos like this, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. You can even add your own spooky stories in the comments or on my Reddit page r/I have a spooky story. Maybe your story will end up in the next video. Good night, sleep tight, and don't let the shadows bite.